Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Matt Townsley. Matt is currently an assistant professor of educational leadership at the University of Northern Iowa. He is a former district administrator and secondary teacher in Solon, Iowa, the Solon Community School District. In 2017, Matt was named Iowa's Central Office Administrator of the Year, and in 2014, Matt was named an ASCD Emerging Leader. His writing can be found in publications such as Educational Leadership, School Administrator, ASCD Express. He's presented at national conferences like Learning Forward, AMLE, just to name a couple. Matt is the co-author of the book, Making Grades Matter, Standards-Based Grading in a PLC at Work. Matt and I share the same passion for assessment and grading, and that is why Matt is here today. So Matt, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Hey, Tom, so good to connect with you, to see you, fellow Solution Tree author and fellow assessment and grading enthusiast. It's a pleasure as well to be a part of your podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's great to finally meet you. We, of course, run in the same circles. We run in the same social media circles. We often are on Twitter chats and Facebook groups together, but we've never met face to face. So this is the first time, and I'm happy to finally make that happen. So I want to center our conversation around assessment and grading reform at the secondary level. But before we get into that, let's talk about your journey. Let's start with your assessment journey. Tell us a little bit about the arc of your career so far, and then maybe, when, where, how did your passion for assessment and grading develop? How did that all sort of come to pass?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Tom, I was as a secondary teacher, as a secondary math teacher, and I wasn't really that great of a math teacher, just another high school math teacher out there. And one of the great things that my school district did is they provided the finances for us as math teachers to go to the state math teacher conference. And so every year I'd go and I'd try to bring back just one new thing to try out my classroom. It was about my fourth year of teaching or so, and I had a choice to make. Would I go to lunch early, or would I go to this breakout session on how to fix how math teachers can fix their broken grade book? So obviously went to the session, right, to learn how to fix my broken grade book, and I came back from that state math teacher conference just super excited. I will never forget the conversation I had with our high school principal at the time. It must have been maybe a day or two later in his office. I was just so elated as this early career teacher about all of these great things I'd heard. I was talking to him just to thank him and to debrief a little bit for allowing me to go, paying for the sub and for my registration, all that stuff. And I really anticipated that he was going to say, hey, you know what, thanks, awesome, how can I support you, type of thing. But instead, he asked me this question: what's holding you back from trying out some of those things you just shared with me? And I was like, I don't know. You see, Tom, there was about 9 weeks left in the school year, and I thought, well, it's kind of late in the year to be, starting something new in my classes. But he really encouraged me to try something out. So I picked my last period geometry class, and I started doing some different things with the grade book that I didn't really know they were called standards-based grading at the time, but I just kind of learned through reading blogs and books and things like that. That's really what I was trying to do. And so to make a long story short, there was another teacher who taught right next door to me, and he was frustrated one day in the parking lot about just teaching in general. And he said to me, Matt, why do I assign so much stuff and then spend most of my time grading that same stuff that I chose to assign, and then spend even more time tracking down students who haven't turned in the stuff that I assigned to them so I can spend more time grading it? And he was just like, he was ready to quit teaching. Yeah. And so I just kind of shared with him some of the things that I was doing in my classroom. And so he became a partner in crime of someone who was going to try out this other stuff. And so then a couple of years later, I moved into a district office in the same school district there. Never intended to try to make a big grading shift, but because of that colleague I had and several other colleagues that just kind of came on board, I got a phone call one day in the district office from our new high school principal who'd rehired. And he said, Matt, we've got a problem. In this one particular class, we have two teachers, as you know, teaching the same class. One teacher, as you know, is kind of trying out this standards-based grading thing, and this other teacher isn't. And we've got parents and kids who are in this class that wants to transfer their kids to the standards-based grading section at the quarter. He's like, I can make that happen, but I can't make that happen for the next 5 years. We got to do something about that. And so that for us was a tipping point. To what extent we were going to kind of allow teachers on a voluntary basis to do these grading things different, or were we going to go on kind of a district-wide journey to see if this was something that we all ought to be doing. And well, history played itself out, and over multiple years, we decided that we're going to be an all-in standards-based grading school there in Solon, Iowa. And it was just really neat. I call them the stars were aligned, the glory years of being a school administrator. Now, it wasn't easy. There was a lot of pushback from different stakeholder groups, but it definitely was a meaningful journey. I learned a lot about myself as an educator. I learned a lot about how to lead change. And that kind of takes me to where I'm at today, Tom. I'm a professor now. It's kind of crazy to call myself a professor, someone in the ivory towers with all the great ideas. But now I teach future principals and superintendents how to lead change, curriculum, of course, grading stuff along the way.
Yeah. So many of us share similar stories about whether it's breaking points, frustration, getting to a place where it's not working for me anymore. And regardless of what label you put on it, and certainly I think sometimes the labels get in the way, what is standards-based grading? And people make a meal out of it instead of just realizing that, I say to people all the time, standards-based grading is like SBG is GBS. Standards-based grading is grading based on the standards. That really shouldn't be that controversial in the 21st century, that we base grades only on the evidence of learning that students produce. But nonetheless, it can be a challenging venture. So that leads me to this next easy question, Matt, #sarcasm. You are the co-author, of course, with Nathan Weir on the book I mentioned earlier, Making Grades Matter, a Standards-Based Grading in a Secondary PLC at Work. So my question to you is let's start with a generic question, a view from, say, 20,000 feet, and we can get into some details for sure. But why, from your perspective, is grading reform exponentially more challenging to achieve at the secondary level, especially when we talk about the high school level? Why does it seem that no matter where you go, no matter who you talk to, it always seems to be at the high school level where it's just that much more challenging to make change happen? So why do you think that is?
I think it kind of goes back to the title that we landed on, the fact that grades actually do matter a ton at the high school level. And it's been kind of an unquestioned practice as to what exactly those grades mean. And I think there's been some assumptions, and I was one of those teachers. I was one of those administrators who just assumed that 5 points in this class meant the same as 5 points in another class. And so I think grades just matter a ton in the eyes of teachers and students, and especially parents. And that makes it very, very, very challenging to kind of unravel what grades and points mean. I also think there's some other factors at play. I think just in general, high school teachers tend to be very content focused. And so they are maybe not as student focused as perhaps maybe an elementary teacher in general. Elementary teachers are generalists, so they're not maybe as attached to math or reading or social studies. Whereas I just love teaching geometry. I love teaching statistics as a high school teacher back in the day. So I think by nature of being kind of prioritizing the content, that can get in the way a little bit in really the focus on the student when it comes to grading practices. I think a third thing that makes grading challenging at the secondary level or the high school level is some of the structures and schedules that go along with it. I think of my sister who has taught elementary before, and I asked her, I said, so what do you do if a student is, struggling with math? And she says, well, there's just kind of certain times a day I can, just pull them aside and help them with a certain concept, because she had those same students for, all day long. A high school teacher does not have that same luxury. When the bell rings, that's when class starts. And when the bell rings again, that's when class ends. And there's practices and fine arts events and buses to get on and off that really kind of get in the way of some of the supports that really students need to be successful when we start thinking about grading. And finally, I think just another reason that perhaps it gets to be a little sticky at the high school level is because so many of our stakeholders, that was their last memory of school, high school. They remember it. They remember exactly, or they think they remember exactly how grading was and assessment was and how school was. And so they would like to enter into the conversation because they were probably fairly successful at it, or were not successful at it, have some very strong opinions on how it ought to be. And those stakeholder opinions and those stakeholder perspectives often kind of play themselves out in maintaining the status quo. And that's not always easy for us as folks who think that maybe grading ought to be a little bit different.
It is definitely one of the hurdles is the fact that for parents and so many stakeholders, standards-based grading, sound grading practices, it just doesn't look and feel like it did when I was in school. And that usually produces an immediate pushback, even though you can eventually win them over and help them understand how it's more effective, more accurate, more clear. That initial pushback. I wonder sometimes too, Matt, do we because I love the title of your book, because I wonder sometimes if, and I'm using the royal we here, I wonder sometimes if we lose secondary audiences by trying to de-emphasize grading too much. What I mean by that is, we can on Twitter and social media sites and at conferences, we can definitely send the message that it's not about the grades, it's about the learning and all of that stuff. And then high school teachers are listening to that message saying, yeah, but grades are the currency with which students, gain acceptance into university and colleges. So you're losing me here because it goes from being inspirational to maybe crossing a line to being a little bit out of touch with what secondary. Do you share that perspective? Do you think that's a possibility that maybe we are going, well intentioned as those messages are we going too far with trying to de-emphasize and crossing the line into a place where we're trying to eliminate, if you will? Thoughts?
I share that perspective, Tom. In fact, I was talking with the administrator last night, and she was sharing with me some of the things that they were doing in their school, and she almost felt guilty. She says, "Well, we're reporting based upon standards in the grade book, but could just see the frown on her face. But we're still determining letter grades at the end." Like she felt like it was something bad, like
Right.
she felt guilty, like she was sharing with me,
Mhm.
and it was something I was going to be disappointed in her in doing. Um, I think there's just some concessions that we often make in secondary schools when we think about maybe the pure way it ought to be, or the way that we've seen it happen in maybe an elementary school setting.
Mhm.
But I feel the same way about the college and university setting. Like there's all kinds of things that we cannot do in the classes that I teach, and so there's concessions that have to be made. A phrase that I often use, Tom, when I kind of hear that that saying that you mentioned there about are we losing track of what grades are? I say let's not let perfect get in the way of progress.
Right.
So if there's some specific things that we can do in our classes today, tomorrow, this year, next year, they're going to help us work towards the ideal. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But we've all read the book. We've all heard the speaker that just says, we shouldn't have grades at all, or grades are terrible, and we should go to a classroom where there is no such thing as chasing grades. But there's got to be something. There has to be some way we provide students with feedback, and most importantly, just a status update, whether that's a letter, a number, or something else. Stakeholders are going to create meaning around that. And I think we can just leverage what they're using, letter grades, numbers, or otherwise, and make better meaning as a result of it.
Right. A letter grade can be representative of a gradation of quality, or it can be under the traditional model, an averaging of old and new evidence and a predetermined percentage increment. I've been saying for years, grades will be as meaningful or as meaningless as the adults make them.
Yes.
And sometimes I think this rush to, and it's this false dichotomy where feedback and grades are put in this kind of contention or this kind of adversarial relationship when they don't serve the same purpose, the formative purpose versus the summative purpose. When people say, grades don't provide meaningful feedback to students, I think to myself sometimes they're not supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of feedback and formative assessment is how you advance learning. Grades are a different purpose for assessment. And, certainly a lot of the hyperbole you see, and listeners know I've ranted about hyperbole more than once on this podcast. I just think, the phrase I use when I talk to Tom Guskey about standardized testing, I just feel like sometimes we need an adult conversation about summative assessment and not fall prey to what's going to get me, clicks and retweets and likes on social media. So let's talk about transitioning, Matt. So we understand that. What do you think the keys are? Like if there's middle school or high school teachers, principals, or superintendents listening right now, and they're thinking, yeah, you know what, we need to make the move as well, away from traditional assessment and grading and moving to ones that more align with our modern instructional paradigm. What do you think the keys are for schools to think about when they think about transitioning to that more modern assessment paradigm?
Yeah, I think a couple things come to mind. One is, and this might be a little bit controversial out there, but is to start small. In some of the places that I've been, I've actually experienced this myself, is that sometimes there's a need or desire for for everyone to kind of take the huge giant leap at once, when not everyone is ready for that huge giant leap. Or let's be honest, Tom, like maybe a school invites Tom Schimmer to come in and talk with them about all these awesome assessment grading practices, but at some point in time, Tom Schimmer is leaving.
Yeah.
And you're going to do a great job, I know, Tom, of trying to build some internal capacity while you're there. But when we start small, and we take some of those folks who are really eager to maybe take that giant leap and they get excited about it, now their experience and their success is much easier to build upon when we take that next group who is willing to get after it. So I think starting small can often be helpful. Of course, not just being satisfied with pockets of excellence, but starting small with a greater purpose of utilizing an early group to move the group later on.
Okay.
Another thing
go ahead.
Another thing I think that's really helpful is starting with the purpose first. We've heard of schools, right, that or educators that say, I'm going to do this specific little tiny thing to my grade book, and that's going to be this thing that everybody ought to do. But then everybody doesn't know why we're doing that specific thing.
Right.
For example, like we're not going to do zeros anymore. We're just going to do 50s instead. Okay, I can comply with that if district office says I have to do it, but I don't really understand why. Mm-hmm. And so if there's never really a strong purpose for why a school is changing their grading practices, I think we're just asking for permission to not have long-term buy-in. Right. And so I think by really trying to formulate a strong purpose for why grades ought to change, and my guess is you and I agree that grades ought to communicate student learning and not be a combination of, points for practice and points for compliance and points for formative assessment and points for understanding stuff. And so if there's just one sole purpose for that, when school leaders really focus their time and energy on that early on, I think there can be some long-term understanding and long-term buy-in, and then of course, some next steps that result of that. And then a final thing that I think that we learned in my former school was hiring. Now, we didn't just look at resumes and say, all right, who has implemented effective grading practices? We started asking some key questions to those that we were hiring. We'd ask them like, hey, what % of student achievement do you think that you're responsible for? And what we were looking for in there is someone who had a high personal ownership in the student learning process. If someone's like, yeah, you know what, 50-50, like, you know what, I think the student ought to just do it. And sorry, you weren't making it to the next part of the list, right? Like you were not going to get hired in our school because you did not feel like you were a part of the learning process. And so I think hiring is perhaps one of those areas of being a part of a high school or middle school that maybe is overlooked when considering grading reform.
Yeah. I want to go back to starting small. I know what you mean by that, but I'm thinking about maybe listeners out there. Can you give us an example of, let's say I'm a high school English teacher or science teacher or whatever. What's an example of starting small?
Sure, yeah. So starting small could be one individual teacher starting small. Like maybe I'm going to, in addition to doing my traditional like 14 out of 16 feedback, I'm also going to disaggregate that essay based upon the specific learning targets or standards. I'm going to, in parallel, give students feedback on points and how I understand the standards. So I'm going to start just real small. I'm not going to upset the apple cart in doing that. So that's at an individual teacher level. At a school level, starting small might involve, as a principal, saying, hey, you know what, I'm just not sure if my whole staff is ready to take this huge giant leap in grading. So perhaps what I might do instead is I might have 5 or 6 teachers who seem to be really willing and excited to get after it. And so these 5 or 6 teachers, we're going to commit to maybe rethinking homework in a different way this semester. And also maybe to providing students for the first time redos and retakes opportunities. We're just going to see how it goes for a semester. We're going to troubleshoot along the way. We're going to meet every month and talk about our successes and challenges. And we're going to try to figure this out together so that hopefully someday, a year or 2 from now, when we ask everyone else in our school to do it, we now have some internal solutions rather than expecting that we can, read it from one of Tom and Matt's excellent books that we wrote.
Right. Those early adopters are definitely role models. They do some of the heavy lifting and learning those lessons. But Matt, I'm sure you've had this question before because I have as well. How do you respond to somebody who says, but Matt, I'm the only one in my department who's interested in moving this direction. And if I start to make any even small changes, the rest of the department's going to be upset with me that I'm the only one allowing reassessments, or I'm the only one that's accepting late work. That's going to put me in conflict with my colleagues. How do you respond to the teacher who sort of asks that question or presents you with that scenario?
Yeah, first of all, I just say, hey, I've been that person. I was the Lone Ranger once upon a time, and it's not easy. And so definitely thank you for your willingness to stick your neck out a little bit and to try these things. The second thing that I'm just a big fan of as a former teacher and school administrator is to seek permission from the school administrator. Hey, I'm thinking about doing these things. I know I might be out in left field or out in right field here, but do I have your permission to try out these things? And then third, I'm not a big fan of surprises. And so I'm going to sit down with my colleagues and just have a conversation with them and say, hey, I'm going to try these things out. A little bit of maybe action research, I'll call it, or a pilot. So it doesn't sound so permanent yet. But I'm just going to try these things out. What questions would you have? What questions would you have if you were trying this out? What would you want to see are the successes and challenges of it? So I'd like to collect the information for you so that I can help you maybe think about it, and I can help myself think about how to do it differently or better. And so I think just kind of framing it as I'm trying this out and I want your input on how to understand if it was effective or not is maybe a soft way of coming into the conversation rather than kind of coming in, guns a-blazing saying you're right, I'm wrong, or I'm wrong, you're right type of thing. Might be a way of bringing others on board.
That's an interesting idea, to ask some questions of your colleagues to say, I'm willing to learn some lessons here. I'm willing to do heavy lifting. What are you hoping that I will learn through this kind of experiment around these practices, whether it's, like I said, reassessment, or it might be something different with homework? What are some of the things that you're curious about, which in turn also has them articulate some of their hesitation, isn't it? It
Yes.
forces them, not forces them, but it sort of engages them in a conversation to say, here's the reason I'm so hesitant about these practices. I think that's a really, really great idea. It leads me now thinking about the book again that you wrote with Nathan, and thinking about the PLC at work structure. From your perspective, why is that structure, the process, the structures, the systems, the routines, et cetera, why are they so perfectly aligned to bring about grading reform? So what are some of the specific advantages that the PLC at work model brings to the table when it comes to reforming your grading practices in your schools?
That, Tom, in particular because in our days of doing this work, we were actually working through the PLC at work process, trying to understand what it was like, trying to understand what it would look like for us as a small, medium-sized school in Iowa to do it. And that was actually, we led with the PLC at work process in our school, and then grading just kind of happened to come alongside of it. And a teacher, this is when I was a district office administrator, he called me one day and said, hey, Matt, what's the connection between this PLC stuff that we're trying to do and this SBG stuff we're trying to do? I mean, he asked me that question. And so I oh yeah, I think I know it in my mind, but I've never articulated it with anyone else. And so, for those familiar with the PLC at work process, there are 4 critical questions that teams often tend to work through. And the first one is, what is exactly that our students should know and be able to do? And the second question is how we know when they have learned it. And I can't think of a better way of going through that process than with a team of teachers. And I can't think of a better example of understanding the value of that process than the pandemic that we're in. So many educators out there are saying, I can't cover the same amount of content I've covered before. Well, in the PLC at work process, we're tasked at prioritizing or creating power standards to understand what the most important standards are that students should know and be able to learn. Often teachers in this kind of grading conversations, they push back on this idea of, I don't have time to teach and assess and reassess and check for understanding and reassess and grade. And where am I going to find this time? And so by prioritizing the standards, by focusing on that first PLC at work question, really helps teams of teachers do it. And then, how we know when they have learned it, I can't think of a better way of articulating how we know when a student has learned it than by reporting it based on the standard. So we think about reporting and communicating student learning by the student, by the standard. But most importantly, Tom, I think it's this. It goes back to the question you just asked me earlier about being a lone ranger trying to do this work. Right. It is lonely work. It is challenging work. That same teacher who asked me about the connection between the PLC at work process and standards-based grading, he was a quality veteran teacher. He said, Matt, I feel like a first-year teacher again, doing all this stuff. And so providing him with a support system of other English teachers who could say, hey, can I look at that assessment? What are the most important standards for you in English 9? Because I've got these different ones, maybe in English 10. How can we calibrate on a vertical level to ensure that students are learning the most appropriate things in English 9 to build upon English 10. So without those conversations, teachers, even if they're not the only one implementing those grading practices, are still going to feel like it because they don't have that support system around them with some of the other, what I would call not really grading stuff that supports the grading stuff. Things like creating assessments, things like understanding what it really means to check for understanding in an effective way. All of those things that really aren't related specifically to grading, but as we think about the whole continuum of assessment, it builds right into it. And
Right.
I'm speaking to the assessment expert here that can articulate that in much better ways than myself.
Oh, I don't know about that, Matt, but I appreciate that. But, the thing that I think you've articulated so well is that, assessment is the engine that drives the collaborative teams within the PLC process, right? The first two questions are assessment questions. The last two questions, how will we respond if they haven't learned it? What do we do to extend the students, is about responding to assessment evidence. And so without sound assessment practices, the process is going to fall flat. And the other thing that I think sometimes gets lost in all of that, which I think you again articulated, is that grading is assessment. We sometimes forget that just because you're assessing for the summative purpose and just because you are producing a report card doesn't mean the principles, PLE principles of sound assessment don't apply. So I think that, going back to the question about the Lone Ranger as well, or the person who's going solo, I think that they're always in a position of strength when they have sound assessment practices which come from research around what good assessment looks like, or even in grading, what good measurement looks like, and trying to bring those two things together. It leads me to, there's a lot of understandings out there. There's a lot of misunderstandings out there. We talked earlier about some of the hyperbole around grades and especially specific to the secondary level and transcripts, et cetera. I'm wondering if there are other aspects of assessment and grading out there that, from your opinion, just continue to be completely misunderstood. You see something on social media and social media is a really dangerous place in a way, because boy, you can get people to like and retweet things. And I look at it sometimes and I think, you got to be kidding me. But have you ever, are there things out there where you say, like, that is unequivocally incorrect? Like, that is just an incorrect assertion. So correct the record, Matt. What messages are out there that continue to leave you frustrated and you think simply go too far?
Yeah, I think one of them, and this is going to be the professor in me coming out here, is the research side behind all of these changes and things we've been talking about, Tom. And it comes from maybe two perspectives. One is that someone will say, well, show me the research that these specific grading practices are better or different. And that's really maybe the wrong question to ask for a couple reasons. One is because, one of your previous guests, Tom Gusky, and some several esteemed colleagues have done some wonderful work in kind of synthesizing what the research says about grading. And basically what it says is that our typical grading practices in the past have done a very poor job of actually communicating student learning. Yeah. But what we're doing in all of these grading conversations is we're saying, I actually want to communicate learning now. And so how can we try to use numbers to show that something that was never actually communicating learning is now going to better communicate learning? It's like saying that speaking Spanish is better than English or French or whatever. They're just different ways. And we hope that we're communicating in the most effective and clear and transparent way. And so to try to point to some type of quantitative analysis, and I've done this, to show that these specific grading practices are better or different, is just, it's the wrong question. And it's also the wrong conversation to get into. The second thing that I think is out there that sometimes gets thrown around, maybe on the other side of those that don't see these grading shifts as being helpful or valuable, is that when we do make these grading shifts, that somehow we are dumbing down the curriculum, or that we don't care about responsibility anymore, or that students are just allowed to be as flexible as they want to. And again, we see this in the pandemic, right? And I actually saw one of my colleagues the other day said, hey, I've just been way too flexible in the midst of the pandemic. Like, he felt like some of his students were kind of taking advantage of it. And so I understand why folks see this. But I think the missing link in all of the secondary grading reform conversations is we talk a lot about the reassessment procedures. We talk a lot about the flexible deadlines. We talk really more about a mastery mindset. But we've lost in the conversation, what's it mean to actually, for a student to be responsible? And if we're going to expect them to be responsible, we have to teach them to be responsible. any awesome biology teacher out there could tell us the specific day that he or she taught mitosis, check for understanding of mitosis, check for understanding again of mitosis, and then summatively assessed the mitosis, cell stuff. And then, but if we ask that same teacher, when's the day you taught what it means to be responsible? Check for understanding what it means to be responsible. Had a whole class lesson on what it means to be responsible, and differentiate that between what it means to be responsible as a 9th grader versus a 12th grader. And so if we're going to teach and expect responsibility, we have to teach and expect responsibility. And we could report out the extent to which a student is being responsible, or whatever other 21st century skill there is. And so I think those that kind of criticize the movement for not having a strong emphasis on responsibility in 21st century skills, I think to a certain extent we have to own it. Because in general, at the secondary school level, we have not done a good job of explicitly teaching and assessing and laying out clear success criteria for what that means.
Yeah.
And again, I'm here to say, Tom, I've been a part of those conversations, and we're going to clear the air right now. No more. Hold me accountable on social media.
There you go. It is interesting how some of the conversations or the narratives kind of get hijacked. I think of two in particular that often come up in the trainings and workshops. One is when I talk about not penalizing late work, the sort of pushback for people is I say, we need to stop penalizing late work because it distorts achievement. And the pushback is, but Tom, deadlines matter. And that again is a false dichotomy. It's kind of hijacking the conversation, that the idea that because you're not docking somebody for late work doesn't mean that you don't adhere to deadlines. And the other one is the homework piece, which is, homework shouldn't contribute to a student's proficiency grade. A, it comes early in the learning, and 2, you can't confirm who did the work. But the response is often, but Tom, kids need to practice. Again, false dichotomy here. We're creating this false tension between those two ideas. Not counting homework towards someone's achievement grade doesn't mean it's not important. So it's just interesting to me. I think you've touched on a couple of really, really good points about where's the research crowd too. That's always an interesting conversation, isn't it? Because I don't think they realize what can of worms they're opening up when we start examining the lack of research that supports traditional grading practices.
Yes. Yeah. And that's funny though. My colleague Nathan was actually in a meeting once where, not in our school, but in a different school. And that came up. Yeah. There's some folks that said, well, what's the research say about this? And he said, all right, we're going to pause this meeting. And next meeting, everyone's bringing their research. Everyone's bringing their research, right? And I'll give you all the usernames and passwords to electronic databases. And it's just not there, Tom. You're right. It's just the points and percentages and A, B, C, D, skip E, go to F. We've all inherited that system.
Right.
It's not like a bunch of smart people got in a room and decided it's the best way to do it. We've just inherited it.
That's right. And I don't know anyone who, if given a magic wand and could have the opportunity to invent a system, would invent the tradition. Maybe somebody would. I just don't know them. Who would invent the system where we're locked into? And I think what happens is some of these traditional practices they came first, and therefore they get embedded or entrenched into our work. So I want to step into that research area. It's a good segue for us to talk about the article that you co-authored with Tom Guskey and Tom Buckmiller, and it was called "The Impact of Standards-Based Learning Tracking High School Students' Transition to University." That, of course, is one of the assertions that many people pushing back against standards-based grading or sound grading practices, they push back and say, our students aren't going to be ready for college. They're not ready for the university level. We're quote unquote dumbing it down. We know that's not true, but that's the assertion that's given. So that study was sought to determine if the implementation of standards-based learning in high schools actually affects students' transition to learning in university courses. So tell us a little bit about the study, and then tell us what you found.
Yeah. So the first thing you should know about the study, Tom, is it's like almost every study I have the luxury now of trying to do. There's a personal side to it. As a former district office person, we had questions about our high school students. Hey, if we do this, are we going to somehow disadvantage them getting into university? And we were fortunate enough to be 10 miles away from the biggest university in Iowa, University of Iowa Hawkeyes down there. And so we could invite those folks to the conversation, have them, kind of explain, we could ask them questions. And so we kind of were able to get the confirmation that we were not going to disadvantage them. But just to make sure, Tom Buckmiller and another colleague and I, we actually went around and talked to all the university admissions folks in public universities in Iowa, and helped them understand what some high schools in Iowa were doing, and I just had a conversation with them like, are students going to get a fair shot getting in? And they confirmed like, yeah, no problem at all. Like as long as there's a letter grade and GPA, no big deal at all. And so that was kind of the first step in this personal journey that I had in trying to help high schools really make this shift. But then the question turned from, in the eyes of some parents and other stakeholders, all right, I understand that students are going to get a fair shot getting into college or university, but what about getting through?
Mm-hmm.
What about once they step into that class where we know that those professors are not going to be, perhaps using some of those highly effective grading practices that we've talked about today? Are they going to like have to go through some process? Are they going to like not have as great of a college experience? And so that's what we did at a university, a private university. We sent out an email to all of the freshmen and said, hey, if you're interested, be a part of our study. Could you just let us know, based upon kind of these criteria, if the extent to which the high school that you attended implemented these grading practices? And so they kind of like self-disclose if they went to a specific standards-based grading like high school. And so then we asked them a series of questions, and then we invited a subset of them to actually be a part of some interviews. And we asked them things like, hey, just tell me about your high school. So we can kind of confirm the extent to which they were actually a part of a standards-based school. And there's all across the board, as you can imagine, right, Tom? There's schools out there that say they're standards-based and they're not yet there. And there's others that are really rocking it. And so we kind of found out, and one of the things we wrote about in our paper is that high schools in general are still kind of in the early phase of implementing these effective grading practices. But no matter where those students came from, what we found out is that they had probably like you and I did back in the day, a transition from being a high school student to a college student. There's a lot of temptations and challenges and things that go along with that. And what they told us is like grading practices was not really high on their list of things they had to adjust to. It was things like, making friends, time management, all of those things that they had to get used to. And so we wanted to share that story with a broader audience, that from the trenches, these freshman students at the end of their first semester told us, when it was fresh in their mind, that, hey, this adjustment to different grading practices at the university level was not a serious adjustment for us. Yeah. And so we hope that message provides just a little bit of a weight off the shoulders for school board members, for principals, for teachers, for other folks out there who are considering making these changes in their high school. Of course, it was really a fun study for me to see come to fruition a number of years later at the university level. Now, I wish we would have had it back in the day, Tom, when I was leading that change in Solon, right, Iowa.
That is really interesting because, so much of traditional grading has to do with leverage. It has to do with coercing behavioral compliance through almost fear-mongering, threats about the unknowable future. When you get to college, that's where we gain, a lot of, I know back in the day when I first was teaching and I was a traditional grader, that's where I gained a lot of leverage with students was, wait till you get to university, yes, boy, this is going to be like, and realizing and having some tangible evidence that that's just not the major adjustment. And it would be so easy to look at a student who did poorly in university and conflate that lack of success to the grading practices that they experienced in high school, when there are so many other confounding effects that contribute to the differences between high school and college. It would just be so easy for the naysayers, if you will, to point to, well, you see, we shouldn't have implemented standards-based grading because now our kids are failing college and university. So Matt, that is a really great study. And I think that's a wonderful contribution to the conversation, because I think sometimes for many of the right reasons, I should say, teachers are concerned about students getting into university, but at the same time, the college admissions offices, I think sometimes we forget they're getting students from all over the world.
Yes.
They're getting IB students, they're getting students from different countries that have different grading scales, and somehow they figure out how to admit all those students. And it is just the idea that an Iowa school is going to take no students from the state of Iowa because they're all standards-based schools is just absurd. So I know where teachers are coming from. I don't mean to be disrespectful or insensitive to that, but it's just an interesting conversation. So I really want to thank you for that study, because I think it's a wonderful contribution to the conversation, specific to the conversation at the secondary level. So I want to finish up today with maybe some advice for getting started. We talked about the individuals starting small and going from there, but let's say I'm a school principal and I've got a few teachers. So I've got a few teachers starting small. I've got this kind of guiding coalition. I've got this team of people who are early adopters, and they're pursuing grading reform. I know it's important. I can see the big picture and trying to build this different kind of assessment culture. So how do we go from that small team? So I've got those early adopters. What's the key in your mind, or what are the keys in your mind to building consensus? How do we go from the small group of early adopters who started small? How do we start to broaden that to it becoming a school mandate?
Yeah. So in our experience, and we write about this a little bit in Making Grades Matter, is it first starts again with establishing a building or district-wide purpose. Here's what the purpose of grading is in our building or in our district. And then once we have that specific purpose in mind, now we're going to articulate maybe 3 to 5 principles. I think I've heard you talk about this, Tom, a little bit about making sure we have some specific grading principles in mind. And we're going to focus on those principles, right? It's one thing to say, oh, we're doing standards-based or standards reference grading. It's another thing on paper to articulate exactly what we mean by that.
Right.
And so first purpose, and then having some specific principles. And then with the pilot, you see the P's I'm going with here, Tom.
Yep.
Purpose, principle, and pilot. And with that pilot, we're going to give them permission now to try out those principles. And one of the things I learned a lot from, I think it was Rick DeFore, he talked about reciprocal accountability. He talked about creating tight and loose structures in a PLC at work process. And so what we did is we decided that we're going to also have tight and loose principles that go along with our standards-based grading implementation process. And so that's what I recommend that schools do as well. As I say, okay, everybody's going to do this aspect of homework. We're not going to assign any point value to it, but what freedom are we going to allow teachers to have? And so with that pilot group, kind of figure out where those parameters are. Same thing with reassessments, right? Like I wish that I could go back and reassess in my high school government class to improve my grade. That's just not a reality, right? And so within the reporting period, right? Like maybe we can squeeze it down. All right, maybe reassessments are going to be between 2 weeks and 5 weeks or something. I don't know, whatever those parameters are the school decides. Let's allow our pilot group to start helping establish what some of those parameters are that are going to contextualize these changes for us in our school. So that way, when we present it to the next group, it's not just a free for all, and B, now we have some time tested parameters to work within. At some point in time, though, Tom, there's every school, there's teachers that are excited about it, the early adopters. There's teachers who are, I'll do it if I see the early adopters doing it. And there's some that they're like, you know what, I just like my job here, and so I'm just going to do it to keep my job here. And there's others that, for whatever reason, don't understand it or don't believe in it yet.
Right.
And so at some point in time, the schools that I've seen after they go through that pilot process, maybe even bring on another group of teachers, they just say, hey, we're doing this because, as you can see over here with this group of teachers, it's happening. And so now within the next 1 or 2 years, I expect you to do this.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes what can be really helpful is to not only have those specific grading principles laid out, but as we did in Making Grades Matter, to articulate what it means to implement those specific grading principles. So in our book, you'll see at the end of every chapter, there's kind of like a getting started, kind of a middle ground, and then what it means to really implement that specific grading practice at a high level. And I believe the best school years I know are going to provide both pressure and support for teachers to get there. The support is, here is the continuum, and I'm going to give you the time to get there. I'm going to pay for a sub so you can get some support from somebody else. I'm going to buy a book from Solution Tree so you can learn more about it. I'm going to send you to the assessment and grading conference so you can learn more about it. But I'm still expecting you to get there.
Right.
And so I think that's really what it takes. And I'm just so happy to know that there's wonderful, wonderful school years out there that get and understand this. But it's not easy work, as you and I both know.
No, it's not. You're reminding me of an experience I had very early in my career, and I have to give a shout out to a former principal that I worked with. His name was Bill Bidlake, and in one high school that we were having these grading conversations in, he talked about our first year actually being our year zero. It was being our year of exploration. We're going to put this content in front of people at every faculty meeting. We're going to talk about it. We're going to make sure and that everybody knows that going into next year, this is what's expected. He was just masterful at one of Bill's real strengths was managing personnel, if you will. And I don't mean that in the cynical sense, but he was just really great at messaging. He understood people as well as any principal I've ever worked with. And then, of course, from my role in that, it was kind of being the pit bull assessment guy, engineering those conversations. But I just thought that set a great tone. I learned a lot from that experience. That's going back to the 2006, 2007 school year. I learned a lot from that experience about pacing the work. And I thought that was very wise on his part to say, we're going to take a year of exploration. And of course, in that year of exploration, what do you have? You have early adopters. Yes. And they start to become the models. And pretty soon we had some real momentum going in that school. So really, really a great experience. So I love that description from you, because you took me back to 2006, Matt. That was great. Matt, listen, this has been a great conversation from my perspective. I know you and I could both talk about assessment and grading all day, but we can't turn this into a 4-hour 4-hour episode. So we're going to have you back for sure at some point down the road, whether it be another book or any research findings that you have. Somewhere along the way, I know I'm going to have you back, Matt, because I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. But we're going to finish up today, as you know, with a segment I call 3 Questions. And that's going to be a little bit of a fun turn here to ask you 3 lighthearted questions so listeners can get to know you a little bit more on a personal level. Nothing too intrusive, of course, but I'm just going to ask you a series of questions, and you take those questions in whatever direction you want to take them. So here's the first one. First one will be an easy one, Matt. What is the most underrated aspect of living in Iowa?
Ooh, wow. Most underrated aspect of living in Iowa.
What don't people get about Iowa?
Well, first, if you just drive through on Interstate 80, Tom, and that's really what most people do if they've never been here, is they just see the cornfields, right? They see cornfield, Iowa City, cornfield, Des Moines, cornfield, Council Bluffs, right? I mean, they feel the same way about Iowa that I feel about driving through Nebraska when my family vacations to Colorado. So it's more than just cornfields, I think. We have a very, 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 I'll say this, very accessible state park system, Tom. So if you're ever in Iowa, check out the state parks. There's no registration, there's no fee. You just drive your car and you go to the state parks, which is wonderful. A lot of good, not like mountain hiking, but just very good scenic hiking, bluffs in different areas, rivers and ponds and trout streams, and just a wonderful place to go outdoors. One of the nice things about living in Iowa is the population density, right? Like there's a reason that people leave Iowa to go somewhere else during spring break because of the weather. Right. But the population density is desirable. And I kind of joke, like if San Diego got transplanted into Iowa, like if we had that nice of weather, our population density would just skyrocket. Right. But as a result of there not being as many people here in Iowa, it makes the state parks that much more enjoyable too, because they're not very busy.
Yeah. Having been to Iowa several times, for sure, I know what you're talking about with the cornfield, Des Moines.
Yep, you got it.
But I have thoroughly enjoyed. I think I've been to Iowa close to half a dozen times, and I always enjoyed my time there. Okay, second question, and this is a this or that choice here. Okay. Marvel or DC superheroes?
Oh boy, you're testing my knowledge here. Marvel, maybe because a couple of my boys are interested in it, but okay. I don't know a whole lot about either one, actually.
Okay, well, I just throw that out
there. Marvel, just because my kids maybe are more interested in it than the other. Yeah.
Do they have a favorite?
Oh, anything that's on the TV, probably anything they can find on, that's streaming somewhere. But yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one.
Well, yeah, and for me, if it's Marvel, it begins and ends with Deadpool for 2 reasons. The movies Deadpool were filmed here in Vancouver.
Really?
And Ryan Reynolds is Canadian, so I'm all over Deadpool.
Like a special Canadian bond, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah.
There's just something special about
we are obnoxious about telling you which famous people are Canadian, and I think it's because we think we get a little piece of that. Okay. I don't know what it is, but we take pride. If anyone famous is Canadian, we will make sure you know about that.
Hey,
okay, all right. You ready for this one, Matt? Here's the third one. We're going to dig deep here, Matt. What is something what is something about yourself that even you sometimes find annoying?
Man.
Like you look in the mirror and go, yeah, I'm going to have to give them that one.
All right. If I were to get really close here, my nose, it's crooked, Tom. At
I
some
can't see
point,
it.
at
I
some
can't see
point,
it.
at some point in time. Okay, so at some point in time, here's how I found out as well. I've got 4 kids, and they're at least 2 of them are at the age where they're just unfiltered and they just talk. And so the two older boys, they've at different times said, "Why is your nose crooked, Dad?" And I think it goes back to playing like junior high basketball or something like that and getting hit in the face. I was not that great of a basketball player, Tom. Wore glasses, broke glasses, had kind of the Horace Grant rec specs for a while type of thing because
Okay.
broke so many glasses.
Yeah.
But it's annoying, mostly because when it comes up in conversation, it comes up at the most inopportune times. Like when just like the dentist or something like, "Hey, did you something happen to your nose?" I don't want to talk about that right
People need filters, don't they?
now. Yes.
I was thinking more about characteristics or attributes,
Oh, gotcha. Well, we can go there too.
but
Yeah,
you
we can go there
but
too.
you went down the what I look like. I meant figuratively look in the mirror and say,
Yeah.
"Oh,
Okay.
yes,
All
I am
right. All
annoying that
right.
way." But that's
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. We can leave it
All
there.
right. All right.
Have you got one that comes to mind?
I was thinking, my just I don't know. It's just the way I am. I too often, if I see a fact that is just blatantly not true, I just sometimes cannot. I just can't hold back the temptation, Tom, to go
Yeah.
on Google and find the source and be like, plop right there.
Right.
It's not a good trait.
Yeah.
It's good for being a researcher, but not good for making friends and influencing people sometimes.
It's not good for the social dynamic. Let's put it that way, right?
Yeah, it's not
It's good
good.
for being right, though. It's good for being right.
Well,
That's
yeah,
yeah.
I think if it's just opinions and perspectives, that's great. But if you tell me the population of Iowa is 500,000, I'm gonna make sure it's a lot more than 500,000.
Yeah, well, yeah, like you say, I think every one of those kinds of attributes and qualities have a good place, and sometimes can be our downfall. That's for sure.
Yes, not good.
Last question, Matt. As you know, as I know you've listened to a few episodes, you know that I always end in every interview with a question about success and happiness. It's kind of a theme I'm trying to run through the podcast with everyone I interview. So the question I always finish with is, of course, this one: if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, "What is your definition of success?" how would you answer them?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. One is, for me, success is just knowing that I have not arrived. And like to me, like anytime I feel like in my worldly sense that I have gotten somewhere, just being knocked back by someone, something, an event, and just realizing um, that hey, you haven't arrived yet. To me, that is success.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget when I completed my first graduate degree. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm on top of the world. I've got this degree. And then eventually I kind of realized that I didn't really know as much as I thought, just based upon some conversations I had with some people. And I thought, wow, I need to learn more. And so I just kept learning more and learning more and learning more. And I thought maybe one day if I get a doctorate degree, I might have arrived to be successful. But then I'm now surrounded by a bunch of people that do have their doctorates. And as it turns out, I really don't know hardly anything about the things they know about, and even the things I thought I knew about. And so to me, that sense of just being reminded of stuff I don't know. That's why I write. That's why I talk to people like you, Tom, to find out what I don't know and how I can say and think about things differently. To me, that's success, because that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me going. But when I hit that pitfall in the road and I think that I have arrived, or that I think I'm the expert, or that I know something, it seems in the moment as being successful. But every time I look back, Tom, every single time I realize it was only success for a moment.
Right.
But it's moving above and beyond and past that, and understanding how that moment was actually a setback, really is what helps me maybe define success. Maybe there's just some things I feel and understand about kind of faith as well that play in there, that I have to continually realize that there's a lot of things I don't do right in life that also fuel me to move forward too. So just appreciate the focus you've had on that topic in your podcast, Tom.
Oh, thanks, Matt. It's sometimes cliches are cliches because they're true. And it just makes me think of success is not a destination. Success is the journey.
Mm-hmm.
And not feeling you've ever arrived can really fuel a continual, not just an obsession with external success, but fuel that internal drive to maximize our potential as not just as professionals, but as human beings, right? So I do appreciate that perspective. Matt, thanks so much for being here today. Listeners, you definitely should follow Matt on Twitter. His Twitter handle is at MC Townsley. And yes, you heard me right, MC Townsley. Matt has a future career in hip hop if he ever wants it. But yes, it's at MC Townsley. And that is also Matt's website, where there is just a ton of great information. Matt does an exceptional job of sort of collating and curating different books and different articles around standards-based grading. And I've appreciated being included in some of those lists and all of that. So thank you for that, Matt. But www.mctownsley.net. And again, I can't say MC Townsley with a straight face because it just makes me think that Matt's got a future career, maybe in the karaoke hip hop world.
There you go.
Maybe someday we'll see Matt down there. So Matt, thanks so much for being here today. I look forward to next time.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Right. Thanks.